Carney's response reportedly consisted of a single word, and that response is now prompting many NATO allies to question whether the United States can still be regarded as a stable and reliable partner. In the analysis that follows, we will examine what Trump asked for, why Canada holds a decisive advantage in the nuclear materials supply chain, and why such a brief reply could influence the global balance of power for decades to come. This is what is unfolding behind closed doors, and the seriousness of the matter should not be underestimated. Over the past 3 weeks, the Trump administration has been scrambling to secure uranium supplies for what U.S. officials describe as the most ambitious nuclear energy expansion program ever undertaken. Mr. Trump's objective is to build roughly 200 new small modular reactors to power AI data centers, advanced manufacturing facilities, and military infrastructure. The projected total cost is estimated at $400 billion. However, the plan faces a major obstacle. The United States has virtually lost the capacity to produce uranium domestically at any meaningful scale. According to the latest data from the U.S. Energy Information Administration, the country now imports as much as 95% of the uranium it consumes. Canada, by contrast, accounts for roughly 13% of global uranium production and possesses some of the world's highest-grade deposits, particularly in the Athabasca Basin of Saskatchewan. Against this backdrop, Mr. Trump directly contacted Prime Minister Carney in a phone call that sources described as tense. The request was highly specific: to guarantee the United States preferential access to Canadian uranium at discounted prices, to accelerate regulatory approvals related to nuclear fuel processing, and to commit that Canada would not prioritize uranium sales to China or other strategic rivals. According to 3 officials familiar with the exchange, who spoke to Reuters on condition of anonymity, Mr. Trump stressed that this was a matter of shared security and a test of the allied relationship. He is said to have argued that expanding U.S. nuclear energy would benefit both economies while reinforcing North America's energy independence. Yet, according to one source, after a silence described as notably heavy, Mr. Carney's reply amounted to a single word. Not an agreement to discuss, not a promise to consider the request, but simply, no. And that brief refusal is now sending significant shockwaves across today's geopolitical chessboard. Within just a few hours of that phone call, NATO officials in Brussels were forced to convene emergency meetings. Several European allies began to ask whether the US-Canada relationship, long a cornerstone of North American security and anchored by the world's longest undefended border, was developing serious cracks, and the situation did not stop there. Almost immediately, Ottawa opened formal discussions with France, the United Kingdom, Japan, and South Korea on long-term uranium supply agreements. According to Bloomberg, the total value of these contracts over the next decade could reach approximately $18 billion, and notably, they exclude the US market entirely. Mr. Trump's team is said to have been caught flat-footed by this development. With a single move, Mr. Carney turned Canada's strategic resources into a source of leverage over Washington, something few had anticipated. But to understand why this matters so profoundly, it is necessary to look beyond the simple buying and selling of uranium. First, one must consider Canada's true role in the global nuclear supply chain. Canada is not merely a uranium exporter. It is also an influential hub of nuclear technology. The country operates CANDU reactors, widely regarded as among the most advanced and reliable heavy water reactor technologies in use today. In Saskatchewan, Cameco has emerged as one of the world's leading uranium producers, extracting roughly 30 million pounds annually from deposits whose quality far exceeds that of most other sources. The figures explain why Canada occupies such a unique position. Uranium ore in the Athabasca Basin has an average grade of around 20%, while the global average typically ranges from just 0.1 to 0.3%. In other words, Canadian uranium is tens to hundreds of times richer than that of many competitors. This translates into lower extraction costs, fewer processing steps, and significantly less waste. In the nuclear fuel sector, Canadian uranium is widely regarded as the gold standard. According to data from the World Nuclear Association, the United States currently imports most of its uranium from Kazakhstan, which accounts for roughly 1/4 of total supply, followed by Russia, Australia, and Canada, with smaller volumes from African producers. This, however, is precisely Mr. Trump's dilemma. Kazakhstan remains heavily influenced by Moscow, while Russian uranium has become politically sensitive following the conflict in Ukraine. Australia, for its part, faces short-term constraints on expanding production capacity. Taken together, these factors leave Canada as the only stable allied supplier with sufficient scale. That is why Mr. Trump's demand for uranium is existential in nature. The scale of the White House plan is not only vast, it also requires long-term supply that is reliable and carries minimal political risk. At this point, the balance of power begins to tilt toward Ottawa, and the story moves far beyond that of an ordinary commercial contract. The surge in artificial intelligence is driving an increasingly intense thirst for energy. OpenAI, Google, Microsoft, and Amazon are all racing to build massive data centers that operate continuously, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That level of reliability can be delivered at scale only by nuclear power, while also producing no carbon emissions. A single large AI training facility can consume a steady 100 to 300 megawatts of electricity, roughly equivalent to the power needed for about 200,000 households. Against this backdrop, Mr. Trump recently unveiled plans to fast-track the deployment of small modular nuclear reactors in order to dominate the AI energy market. The economic opportunity has been described as enormous, with potential value reaching as much as $2 trillion in the coming years. But all of those ambitions become meaningless without a stable supply of uranium. And that is where the question arises: why did Mr. Carney choose to say no? The answer lies in a very basic assessment. In recent months, Trump has treated Canada not as an equal partner, but as a subordinate. Just weeks earlier, he had threatened to impose 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, downplayed the importance of Canada's energy sector, suggested that Canada should become the 51st U.S. state, and repeatedly displayed a dismissive attitude toward Washington's second-largest trading partner. A senior Canadian official told the Globe and Mail that the prevailing view in Ottawa is that Trump only reaches out when he needs an immediate advantage, never with the aim of building a genuine partnership. It was in this context that Carney's decision took on clear strategic calculation. By rejecting Trump's request, he achieved three objectives at once. First, he reaffirmed Canada's sovereignty. After months of pressure tactics, ranging from tariff threats and jabs about annexation to overt condescension, Carney sent a clear message that Canada is not a country to be bullied. At home, the reaction was almost immediate. According to the latest Angus Reid polling, support for Carney jumped by 11 percentage points within just 72 hours. Canadians are rallying behind a leader willing to say no when it matters. Second, he created significant leverage ahead of upcoming CUSMA negotiations, placing Ottawa in a more proactive position vis-à-vis Washington. Trump needs precisely what Canada possesses, and once that reality became clear, the threats of tariffs and aggressive trade demands suddenly lost much of their force. When the future U.S. economy depends on Canadian uranium, the tone changes immediately. At this point, Carney can calmly say, "You want our uranium? No problem, but in return lift the steel tariffs, end the imposed conditions on the dairy sector, and treat Canada like a genuine ally, not an adversary to be coerced." The third objective, and the most subtle move of all, lies in Carney's effort to reposition Canada as an independent middle power, no longer automatically orbiting Washington. By simultaneously opening negotiations with France, the United Kingdom, Japan, and South Korea, Ottawa sent an unmistakable message: Canada has options. These countries are all hungry for stable uranium supplies unconnected to Russia, and they are willing to pay a premium for the reliability and predictability that Canada offers. According to Christopher Sands of Johns Hopkins University, who spoke with us earlier this week about energy issues, Canada's nuclear sector provides the country with a rare strategic advantage. Uranium and nuclear technology today carries strategic weight comparable to oil in the 20th century. Carney understands that this is not a short-term decision, but a way of positioning Canada for an entire generation ahead. The uranium market itself is now facing a severe supply squeeze. Spot prices have climbed from roughly $48 per pound to nearly $89, an increase of about 85%. As reactors are restarted, new projects come online, and supply tightens. Cameco noted in its most recent quarterly earnings report that the bulk of its production has already been sold years in advance. In practical terms, there is almost no spare capacity that the Trump administration can quickly access. Trump's team appears to have assumed that Canada would comply automatically, operating on the belief that allies always help one another. but they misjudged the extent of the damage Trump's earlier actions had inflicted on the relationship. And now the central question is this: who will truly bear the consequences of this nuclear standoff? The fallout does not stop in Ottawa or Washington. It extends directly into the heart of America's technology sector. Silicon Valley is coming under real pressure. Microsoft has committed $80 billion to artificial intelligence infrastructure in the coming years. Google plans to invest roughly $75 billion, and Amazon Web Services is expected to pour in another $100 billion. All of these investments depend on one indispensable prerequisite: a stable supply of nuclear energy. And at this moment, the key to that supply rests in Canadian hands. All of these plans rest on a single critical assumption: the availability of abundant, stable, and predictable electricity for decades to come. At that scale, nuclear power is virtually the only carbon-free option capable of meeting demand. According to information shared recently by two major technology companies, their senior executives have begun to question whether today's highly ambitious growth scenarios remain realistic. If a reliable uranium supply cannot be secured, nuclear projects will be delayed or postponed. If nuclear power cannot be expanded on schedule, the pace of artificial intelligence development will slow. And if AI loses momentum, the United States' technological edge over China will erode. A senior executive at a Fortune 50 technology firm told the Wall Street Journal that the industry could face delays to multi-billion-dollar investments if the energy challenge is not resolved. In his words, the current uranium shortage represents a level 5 risk to the entire technology ecosystem. If the expansion of nuclear power is blocked, the United States will be forced to rely more heavily on natural gas to provide baseload electricity. The result would be higher gas prices, leading to increased heating costs for households and higher operating expenses for energy-intensive small businesses. Markets have already begun to reflect this concern, with natural gas futures rising 4.7% in a short period as traders price in a worst-case scenario. Consider a small manufacturing facility in Pennsylvania, running industrial production lines. If electricity prices rise by 15 to 20% because nuclear projects are delayed and gas becomes the default option, profit margins would quickly be wiped out. Layoffs, and even plant closures, would become difficult to avoid. At the level of national security, the risks are even greater. The U.S. Navy currently operates 86 warships, including nuclear-powered aircraft carriers and submarines, which form the backbone of American naval power. These reactors require highly enriched uranium. While, in theory, military supply chains are separate from civilian markets, in practice, the processing facilities and underlying supply chains serve both sectors. Major defense contractors such as Bechtel, Fluor, and BWX Technologies hold contracts worth billions of dollars tied to the construction and maintenance of nuclear infrastructure. This week, their share prices fell by between 3 and 8% as investors realized that access to Canadian uranium is no longer guaranteed. At this point, the issue extends well beyond economics alone. NATO's entire strategic posture has long been built on the assumption that the United States and Canada are always closely aligned on defense and security matters. When that assumption is called into question, not only markets but the alliance's security architecture itself begins to tremble. Canada and the United States have long worked in close coordination through NORAD, Arctic defense, submarine detection, and a range of other highly classified security programs. For that reason, NATO allies in Europe are watching current developments with visible surprise. A senior European diplomat told Politico Europe that if Washington and Ottawa cannot even agree on uranium trade, it raises serious questions about how fully one can rely on coordination should NATO's Article 5 ever be triggered. This level of discord is rare between two partners long regarded as the closest within the alliance. France, meanwhile, is moving quickly to seize the opportunity. The office of President Emmanuel Macron has just confirmed that Paris and Ottawa will sign a strategic cooperation agreement on civilian nuclear energy during Prime Minister Carney's visit to Paris next month. France would secure a stable uranium supply for its 56 operating reactors. Canada would gain a major, reliable customer while simultaneously deepening its ties with Europe. The United States, in this scenario, is left on the sidelines. Michael Schellenberger, a prominent advocate of nuclear energy and founder of Environmental Progress, has warned that if the United States cannot sustain a uranium partnership with Canada, its closest ally, It would signal serious failures in Washington's foreign policy. China, he argues, would not hesitate to step in as an alternative buyer. A recent risk assessment by Eurasia Group likewise identified US-Canada relations as one of the most underestimated geopolitical risks facing markets today. Investors have yet to fully price in the possibility of a deep rupture between these two allied economies. Markets have begun to react. Spot uranium prices jumped 7% this week, the largest single-day increase in 18 months, as traders realize that supply could tighten further if Canada prioritizes sales to non-US partners. Mr. Trump's team is scrambling for an exit. Publicly, they are attempting to play down the issue, insisting that discussions are still ongoing. Behind the scenes, however, many officials acknowledge they were genuinely caught off guard by Ottawa's firm stance. Republican senators from states with major nuclear infrastructure, such as South Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia, are pressing for answers on fuel security. Meanwhile, in Canada, Mr. Carney is being praised by the media as a shrewd strategist, one who has turned a national resource into geopolitical leverage at precisely the critical moment. With a single phone call, he shifted the balance of power, turning Mr. Trump's vulnerability into an advantage for Canada. What is striking now is the discussion unfolding among analysts, in boardrooms, and within the nuclear industry itself. The coming months could prove decisive in determining the direction of Canada-US relations for decades to come. Dr. Pippa Malmgren, a former White House advisor and geopolitical economist, wrote in a recent analysis that Mr. Carney's decision to say no may be the most strategically significant move by a Canadian Prime Minister since the Trudeau era. In her view, Ottawa is signaling that Canada intends to act as an independent power, rather than a satellite orbiting Washington. If that interpretation holds, this is not merely a commercial decision, but a fundamental recalibration of the North American relationship. Domestically, Jonathan Wilkinson, former Minister of Natural Resources and now a leader in the opposition, told CBC that the Carney government is simply applying the same transactional logic Mr. Trump has used with the rest of the world. If Mr. Trump treats alliances as business deals, then Canada will negotiate like a company, putting Canadian interests first, assessing value, and refusing to accept imposed terms out of historical habit. In the United States, reactions have been divided. Senator John Barrasso of Wyoming, chair of the Senate Energy Committee, issued a statement calling Canada's position disappointing and short-sighted, arguing that energy security should be kept separate from political disputes among allies. Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, often seen as a more moderate Republican voice, framed the issue differently. Perhaps, she suggested, Washington needs to ask why its closest ally felt compelled to say no, and what the United States has done to erode trust to that extent. These are uncomfortable questions, she acknowledged, but unavoidable if the relationship is to be repaired. Legal and regulatory risks are also mounting rapidly. The U.S. Nuclear Regulatory Commission is currently reviewing license applications for 47 new reactor projects. Without proof of long-term fuel supply, the approval process could stall at the outset. Utilities typically require fuel supply commitments spanning roughly 20 years before committing to build multi-billion-dollar plants. In other words, this is not simply a question of whether to buy uranium or not. It could trigger a chain of consequences that slows the entire U.S. nuclear expansion and, in turn, reshapes the pace of technological, industrial, and security competition across the region. If supply from Canada becomes unreliable, a wide range of U.S. nuclear projects risk being delayed or even canceled outright. Thomas Isaacs, a former U.S. Department of Energy official and nuclear policy expert, told Arms Control Today that Washington allowed its domestic uranium mining sector to decline for decades, operating on the assumption that allied suppliers would always be available. That assumption is now being seriously called into question. According to Isaacs, the United States may be forced to restart domestic uranium production, a process that is both costly and time-consuming, potentially